Okay, so hi everyone. Okay, so I think we'll get started this evening. Before we do get started, if anyone is really desperate not to be photographed, could you please let one of the two girls currently chugging wine in the corner know, and they'll try and make sure that you're not in any of the photographs. What can I say? It's a Monday. It's hard already, isn't it? So yeah, if you could let them know, and they'll make sure that you're not in any of the photographs. But to get started, I'd love to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Suzanne O'Sullivan, neurologist, Wellcome Book Prize Winner, and of course the author of The Sleeping Beauties, among other things. So thank you so much for joining us this evening for our your first live event.
Yes, this is my first live event, so I'm extremely excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So if we could get started, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background in neurology.
Yeah, so I am a neurologist. So basically, what I write about and what I am trained to do are two slightly different things. I've trained as a doctor, and I was always really interested in the brain. It always just seemed to me that it did a hell of a lot more things than any other organ, fairly obvious statement. And it presented a real kind of opportunity to be a detective, because it really is a sort of specialty where you say, well, you know, your big toe is numb and your right hand is weak. What could possibly be causing that? And then you have to sort of unravel sort of the anatomy of the nervous system to try and sort of locate that somewhere in the body. So it really is a sort of a specialty where, you know, having good clinical skills and being able to sort of unravel these mysteries is what's most important. And that's what really attracted me to it. And I specialize in looking after people with seizures in particular. And, you know, that it's just an incredible sort of thing that I do, in my opinion, because what we do is we video people having seizures and try and sort of figure out from all these strange and wonderful things that happen to them and dreadful things that happen to them, you know, what bit of their brain might be diseased and what might be causing this. So that was sort of my starting point as a doctor. That's what I trained to spend most of my time doing, and that is what I spend most of my time doing. But in the course of this training, I was constantly meeting a single condition which I was never trained to deal with. And that is what we would once have been called hysterical seizures. I'm using that name now just to make sure that I'm being understood in what I'm saying. We wouldn't call them that now. They're called dissociative seizures. But these are seizures that have more of a psychological cause than a physical cause, as in a brain disease cause. And these are so common that they represent, you know, up to a third of admissions to hospital with seizures are actually due to psychosomatic seizures, not due to epilepsy. That is how common they are. And 1 in 5 people who comes to an epilepsy clinic does not have epilepsy. They have psychosomatic symptoms. So they have seizures that would once have been called hysteria. This is the most phenomenally common thing, but I managed to qualify as a consultant neurologist without anyone really instructing me as to what I was supposed to do for people who suffered in this way. And very often these people's seizures, they can last hours, they can have hundreds of them, they're really disabling. And that was really where my sort of writing began, because I spent the first 10 years as a consultant meeting people who had these sort of seizures that, even though I had extensive amount of training, no one ever really instructed me how to help these people. I spent 10 years trying to figure out the answer to that question. And that really led me into writing about the experience of dealing people with who have sort of what we call psychosomatic or functional problems, in order to try, and because this is so common, and yet why don't we talk about it? And that led to my first book, which was called It's All in Your Head, which described the experience of how I learned through working with patients about psychosomatic disorders. And that led to The Sleeping Beauties, which took me a step further. It took me around the world to places like Kazakhstan, Colombia, the US, to meet people who are actually caught up in what are referred to as hysterical epidemics. So it's been a long journey. I've just gave you like about 30 years of history there. There was a few other things in the middle I probably left out.
Notes. So you start the book in Sweden, and that is the kind of one of the first things that you talk about, and it's on the, you know, on things on the blurb, and it's something that maybe people have heard of. What could you talk about the children in Sweden?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the disorders I deal with tend to be called mystery illnesses. And you know what? A lot of the time, they're not actually mysteries. I think mystery is a euphemism we use for things that we have difficulty talking about. So when I'm reading the newspaper and I see a headline that says mystery illness, I'm drawn to it because I wonder if it is related to what I do, and it so often is. So I read in 2017, I read a newspaper headline called Sweden's Mystery Illness. And I learned that it was about a sort of outbreak of kind of bizarre sleeping sickness affecting children in Sweden. So this has been going on since the 2000s, and it's affected hundreds of children. And they range in age from, say, 7 to 18. And these children, they sort of become sort of apathetic. And this condition was first called apathy. They first become apathetic and they kind of withdraw from normal life. And then they withdraw so much that they stop eating, they stop talking, and they stop moving. And they just enter this sort of like Sleeping Beauties kind of state. And some of them have been in this for years. Many stay in it for 6 months, a year, 18 months, but others have been in it for several years. This condition is called resignation syndrome. And in 2018, I arranged to visit some of these children because I often see people who have these sort of prolonged coma states, but not exactly like these children and not lasting as long. So I want to try and kind of understand it a little bit better. And when I visit the children, I mean, I met these two tiny little girls, a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old, and they look incredibly healthy. But they were lying in bed completely, one of them completely unresponsive when I walked into the room. You know, she didn't open her eyes, she didn't move. She had a nasogastric tube feeding her to keep her alive. Her parents kept her joints and her muscles healthy through physiotherapy, and she'd been like that for several months when I met her. And her parents sort of picked her up when I was in the room just to show me what her condition was like. And she was literally like a little rag doll. She didn't open her eyes. She just flopped around in her father's hands. And it was very disturbing. And she had an older sister in the bed next to her, in a bed next to her, who was in a slightly earlier stage of this condition, who was opening her eyes a little bit. Now, both of these children were from an ethnic minority, and they were seeking asylum in Sweden. They had both fled Syria and were they had been in Sweden for several years, and they were going through a very slow asylum process. They'd really only ever known living in Sweden. And there was something, apart from the state of these children, something else really disturbed me when I was there. You know, they weren't the only children I met, and they're not the only children in this condition. The thing that disturbed me most when I was there is how much everyone wanted me to tell them what bit of the brain was keeping these children in this condition. And I agree, that's interesting. That's scientifically interesting. That's biologically interesting. But what we know about these children in resignation syndrome is that every single one of them is a child from a family seeking asylum in Sweden who's facing deportation. And the minute I tried to say, well, surely we should address the actual problem, which is they would not be in this condition, the biology wouldn't be behaving this way if we didn't have this problem of them facing deportation. But the doctor who facilitated my visit pretty much shut down that conversation, not out of any, out of kindness, she shut it down, because she pretty much said to me, if you tell people that these children are like this because it's some cultural response to being an asylum seeker, nobody will care about them. And you know what? She's right, because there's asylum seekers and forced immigration all over the world, and we live our lives happily not doing anything about it. So she was really, that's why people were so desperate to talk about it in terms of brain disorders, because if you talk about it as a brain disorder, then it elicits sympathy and action. But if you talk about it as a social problem, it elicits significantly less. It only elicits action from certain types of people, really. Everyone can understand illness and serious illness, but they're less willing to sort of talk about explicitly about social problems. And that really, you'll notice I answer questions, very long answers. I'm sorry.
No, that's what you're here to do.
That really, that led me to the point of wanting to do what I did in this book, which is try and understand this interaction between how kind of social things influence illness. Because that doctor had a point. You know, if I could talk about how society creates illness and how society manifests distress, putting it together with biology, maybe putting the two things together would make people more able to kind of understand and have sympathy for these kind of disorders. And that led me to sort of search out similar mystery illnesses around the world that had their own very unique set of social circumstance creating them.
And for those of us who really don't know anything about this particular state and don't know anything about medicine, what is the key difference between, for example, the state that these children were in versus, say, being in a coma?
So basically, there are good biological measures for a person being in a coma. So if anyone in this room was unaware for any reason, so be that reason sleep, drunkenness, drugs, head injury, brain disease, any brain disease that causes or state that causes you to be completely unaware for entirely sort of biological reasons, will show specific changes in your brain when you measure the brain waves. So it doesn't matter what the cause of that loss of awareness is. If we measured your brain waves, I might not be able to say, without knowing a bit more of your story, what's the cause of the coma, but I can very easily distinguish a coma. I couldn't necessarily distinguish the difference between a coma due to drugs, for example, and a coma due to a brain injury, but I can say that's a coma because the brain waves are the normal brain waves that indicate waking have been disrupted. In these children, when you look at the sort of there are particular brain rhythms that we look at that are only there if you are awake and alert and well, I was going to say aware of your surroundings. That's not strictly true because that's not true for these children, but the brain rhythms that are usually there when you are awake and usually when you're alert. And these children, when you measure the brain in that way, their brains are awake, but they're obviously, their experience of the world, they're not awake. So that's how you can tell the difference between a psychosomatic disorder and another disorder is it doesn't make biological sense. So I think a lot of people think that psychosomatic disorders are a thing your doctor says to you if your tests are normal and they can't find anything else, it's a dismissal. But actually, usually psychosomatic disorders are diagnosed because they don't make biological sense. How can one have the brain rhythms that go with alertness and waking if one actually isn't awake? Then there's some disconnect between what's happening biologically and what's happening to you. What's actually happening to you. So that allows us to know that, these children are not in a coma in the sort of sense of there being a pathological cause, but language fails us here because they are sort of in a coma, but we don't have a word really that is satisfactory for what's happening to them.
And it would generally it could last up to years.
Yeah, I mean, I met a couple of girls who were, I've now forgotten their ages, but I think they were about 15, 16, two sisters who lived in the same apartment block as the other two girls. And they had been like this since for about 5 years. So they were actually going through sort of puberty. Bodies were developing. They didn't look healthy. The two smaller girls who hadn't been in it for so long looked healthy. These older girls, they didn't look healthy, but they were going through all the normal stages of puberty without having any clue what was happening around them. And usually the cure for this is this is a disorder that's caused by hopelessness, and the cure for it is to restore hope. These children do recover if they are given security, but they don't recover. I think people are always suspicious of conditions like this, that, it's a bit like a scene on Little Britain or something where they'll suddenly leap out of the bed and say, fantastic, I'm fine again. They recover at the rate at which you would expect for someone who's seriously disabled. So the little 10-year-old girl that I mentioned before, who was completely unresponsive, I met her in 2018. She still hasn't been given asylum, but she is making gradual recovery, and she's back in school, but she doesn't speak at all. So she's sort of, she's still quite disabled by the condition.
And it's incredible that being given asylum and that factors that most doctors wouldn't even think to consider when figuring out how to help a child is what will bring them out of these states.
Do you know what I think, doctors? I mean, what this case, because I know with my own patients, and I think most doctors know, and especially GPs, for example, who are more holistic than hospital doctors very often, we often know, I see patients every day, and I know that if I could make their lives a lot easier, if I could get them better housing, or I could help them with their benefits, or, and we do try and do that. But you know what? There's so much we can't change as doctors. And that's why I think the conversation is ignored. Because, I know that if my patients had better living conditions, that, they'd be less likely to get sick, etc. But, as a doctor in front of a patient, you can only treat what's right there in front of you. So sometimes we just find ourselves neglecting social factors because they're just, not because we don't know that they're there, but because they're just too big for us to address.
Did any of the girls who had awoken from this state talk about what it was like while they were in it?
Yeah. So it's been very difficult, and not just for me, but for everyone to get a good description from the children who have woken up from it. I think there's a certain reluctance to kind of go there, essentially. However, there have been descriptions. I mean, one boy described that it was like being trapped in a box underwater, and it was like the water was pushing in on you. And that you felt that the box would break at any moment, which is a terrifying kind of description. Whereas another young woman described it differently. She described it as a dream that she couldn't wake up from, which is a slightly less kind of harrowing description. So I think that it's likely that the children may have some awareness, because I see people who have these sort of comatose states for psychological reasons on a daily basis, but not for weeks, not for years, for minutes or hours. And very often they have a little bit of, because their brains are actually technically awake. So it's a little like if you're trying to pay attention to the news, but you're so distracted by something, you're listening for a particular part of the broadcast and you don't hear it, and then you have to go back and play it again. It's that sort of, you're aware and you're trying to pay attention, but some things are going in, but other things aren't going in. So it's not this, I don't believe that these sort of comas are as complete as other types of comas. So I wouldn't be surprised if the children have some awareness of the surroundings at some level. And that was slightly disturbing too on the visit, because there was I met a few of these children, there was a lot of discussion in front of them about not waking up and how they definitely wouldn't wake up, and this had to happen before they would wake up. And, that's how these conditions happen. They're a manifestation of the brain sort of producing, our brains kind of play out our expectations. And if your expectation is you won't wake up until you get asylum, then, it's entirely possible that you will find it difficult to wake up.
Talking about expectations, it's something you talk about a lot in the book, and it's something I never even thought of, that expecting to have a certain illness will mean that you will start developing symptoms of that illness.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's a famous thing that for medical students and nursing students is that they get the symptoms of the disorder they're studying at the particular time. Because we see there's evidence of this around us all the time if we look. So you imagine if you're, I'm not needle phobic, I would say, but I don't love needles, I would say also. So as a needle approaches me, I can't be the only one that starts feeling the pain before the needle has even pierced my skin. I'm certainly not the only, I'm sure people who have to constantly give vaccinations see a lot of people who think they've already had the vaccination when the needle is still being sort of put on the end of the syringe. So, when we're expecting something, what we do is we start searching our bodies for signs of that thing. So, healthy bodies aren't within our awareness. So, I'm at the age now where I've started getting aches and pains, I hate to say it, but but before that, I walked without thinking about it. I jumped up on things without thinking about it. My body was healthy and it did what I wanted it to do. And therefore it was not within my awareness. But if you are given cause to pay attention to your body, it changes the entire experience of how you feel. We must all have, I cannot, please tell me I'm normal. I cannot be the only one who, at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, bought a thermometer and took the temperature like an indecent amount of times. And it was always negative. So then you're just thinking, what's wrong with this thermometer? Because you're given reason to be frightened and you're given reason to examine your body for symptoms. And the minute you do that, you discover that actually the body is awash with changes that are happening all day long. So every time you walk up a flight of stairs, your heart speeds up and you get your breathing goes a little bit quicker. Or if you're sitting down, you know, you might get a bit of numbness in your bum or something like that. And there's all these things are happening all day. You feel dizzy for a moment when you stand up quickly. These are normal physical things that happen to all of us, more to some people than others. And our brains know that these things are normal. And when we're healthy and we've never had any reason to worry about our health, we just don't think about them. So when you walk up the stairs and your heart goes quicker, you barely notice unless it's particularly bad. But what happens when you have sort of an expectation of illness is you start examining your body for signs of change. And the minute you start examining your body, that's when you notice all of these things that have always been there. But because you've never noticed them before, you pay more attention to them and you worry about them. And then what happens when you worry about them is it perpetuates it, because what does worry do? It activates your sympathetic nervous system and it gives you a whole new set of sensations to think about. So an expectation of illness causes you to think about your body differently and use your body differently. And that's when you start noticing things. And the more you notice things, the worse it gets. And there's all sorts of kind of feedback loops that make that worse. You also, you can change the way your body works so easily by just using it slightly differently. I always give the same example, which is if you ask people to walk a straight line along this carpet with heel toe line along this carpet, most of you do it easily, apart from the girls who were chugging the wine, perhaps. But then if I asked you to walk exactly the same line on the top of a wall that was, you know, quite wide, but, you know, high, but safe, it changes the way you walk. Now, suddenly something that was completely automatic, walking, which you never worry about and never think about, is suddenly you're doing it differently just because I've changed the geography of where I'm asking you to walk. So all of these unconscious things about our bodies are so open to being messed with by small provocations. And predictions there is a thing called predictive coding, which is sort of, we think when we're taking in information that we're just, or rather, we don't think this. Many people think that you take in information, it's almost like you're a computer and you're uploading it, you know, into your sort of memory bank or something. But actually, when you're taking in information, you're manipulating it as well as taking it in. So your brain has a set of predictions, templates or priors. So it tells you, you know, a card that's moving like that is probably not going fast enough to hit me, or, you know, that glass is far enough away or is close enough that I can pick it up. And we're learning all these things as that's what we're learning when we're children and we're learning to walk, etc. All of these expectations create templates and expectations in our brains. So when a bit of information comes towards us, we're not only taking it in from the bottom up, we're also doing what's called top-down processing. We're also processing, our expectations are quickly altering that signal to say it's safe to cross the road because that car isn't going too quickly, etc. But unfortunately, you know what? Our brains are not that reliable. Those predictions are wrong all the time. There's lots of visual illusions that you can look at on the internet that will help you to kind of experience this, where you look at something and an image is literally changing in front of your eyes because your brain is trying to make sense of the image to compare it to something that makes sense to you. And these predictions, when they're wrong, they can alter our experience of our bodies. So they can sort of, if these young children, for example, the resignation syndrome children, believe that a person seeking asylum who begins to feel sick, which one might say, if one were facing deportation, feeling a bit sick might not be an unreasonable way for your body to react. But if your expectation is that after I start feeling sick, I know what happens next. The next thing happens is I'll stop being able to talk. And then the next thing that happens is I won't be able to get out of bed. You might start with a physical symptom, which is quite appropriate to the anxiety of your situation, like feeling tired and a fast heart rate. but then the priors or the predictions stored in those children's brains might overwhelm their nervous systems in order to play out this sort of pathological way of responding to their situation. And we're all using these predictions all the time. When we get a vaccination, do we think it's going to make us feel sick? If we think it's going to make us feel sick, probably will make us feel a bit sick. But this is affecting us all the time. But for some people, obviously, it's a lot worse than others.
And we usually do questions at the end, but still, if it's related to this, then absolutely, then do go for it. I'll have to repeat it because you do have a microphone. Actually, we can get the microphone. Is it on at the moment? It's not even on. Ready for Q&A?
Thanks. I just thought I'd ask while we were going. So with expectations, with the brain, should we try to expect health, and should we try to expect a positive outcome?
I don't want to give the impression that one can will oneself well, because there's different sorts of medical problems. So you have diseases that are present. Doesn't matter what you believe, they exist. It doesn't matter what name I give them, they exist. It's just really in the field of psychosomatic disorders. If you are someone who's unlucky enough to find that you develop physical symptoms in the context of stressful situations, if you are someone who has difficulty recovering from injuries, and this is believed to have a psychosomatic cause, then expectations matter a great deal. But I certainly wouldn't wish to suggest that diseases can be influenced by expectation.
The expectation element is really interesting because I think, hearing children get these particular disorders because of the hopeless situations that they're in, it's kind of something we can get our head around. What's really interesting, and it's something that's completely new to me, certainly when I was reading the book, is the idea that this kind of thing can be contagious. And with I believe it's the greasy sickness, the not mosquito community, but mosquito community. Yes. In Texas and also in Colombia as well. So I was wondering if you could talk about those.
So the mosquito people are indigenous people of Nicaragua who live in the Mosquito Coast area. And I met them actually in the States, a group of mosquito people, because they have this amazing condition that is called greasy sickness. So what happens in greasy sickness is it's what we call a culture bound syndrome, which means that greasy sickness only occurs in mosquito people. It's specific to their culture. It's a specific set of symptoms that they have their own attributions for it that don't exist in any other culture. And what happens in greasy sickness is that they sort of get these wild flailing seizures, and it usually affects young women. They run into the jungle. They have to be restrained or they will run away and potentially injure themselves. The legend of greasy sickness is they see a hallucination. They see a person usually, and that hallucination is usually specific in some way to something in their lives. So, they won't all see the same thing. If it's something that is culturally relevant to them. And often because this is a slightly sexualized condition, which is about it's often related to sort of sexual conflict. A man will usually see a woman and a woman will usually see a man. And they get what the people call super strength. So they say it will take, 6 men to hold down a young woman if she has the seizures during this condition, greasy sickness. And they attribute it to a thing called the duende, which is a spirit, which they believe comes to infect the young women, and they treat it with ritualized treatments. Now, I'm telling you all this now, you may well be thinking, well, aren't people strange? Or, but actually this is eerily like many things that I see in my medical practice. And I'll tell you, the only thing that difference is the belief system around it. So we have different kind of religious beliefs and different spiritual beliefs, and that's where they differ. Actually, these people have, this condition is an incredibly sophisticated condition, which these people use sort of partially consciously and partially unconsciously in order to solve certain social problems within the community. So young women are often sexualized by older men, but at the same time, it's a very religious community, and the young women are expected to uphold a very definite standard. And when that sort of conflict arises in the community, the girls will often get greasy sickness. And it is a sort of way for this conflict within the society to be sort of externalized without anyone having to have the uncomfortable conversation about the sexual conflict that has possibly triggered it. And it is a disorder that brings a community response. So if a young woman suddenly gets these seizures, the community will rally around her and support her, which is brilliant, because that's not what happens in this country. When people get those seizures, is that, you know, people are locked away in rooms and told not to come out, not locked away literally, they lock themselves away because these are stigmatized conditions. Whereas these young women, it's a sort of a effective cultural cry for help that speaks a language that the mosquito people understand. But why can't I even address the question I was asked? They're contagious as well. They are contagious, basically. As resignation syndrome was, these conditions can pass from one girl to another. I don't think we should think that's that strange, because it's not unusual for a room, you know, if you're sitting beside somebody who you think has a contagious skin condition, for you to think you have it, and then for you to tell someone else about it, for them to think they have it, or for us all to think we have COVID because we think we've been exposed at a certain point. So these sort of ideas that when one person has something, it spreads to another person really isn't that unusual. I think it's just part of the human experience. But I think that sometimes when people see these kind of disorders, especially in young women, where they're having seizures and it's spreading from one person to another, it comes with all sorts of stigma and judgments that people really misunderstand them.
And one of the fascinating things about the greasy sickness is that there is a cure, essentially, unlike with lots of these seizures.
I mean, that's the beauty of all the people I met in different places having kind of weird things happening to them. You know, the people that just felt the most hopeful were the mosquito people, because this is a condition which is endemic in their community. So they've been dealing with it for a long time. And the advantage of that is that it has a recognized cause and a prescribed cure. So they're treated with sort of doused in this sort of holy water and herbs. So it's kind of a herbal treatment. Medical doctors don't help them. Medical doctors try and biologize and make them worse and give them injections that make them worse. But their local sort of traditional healers can cure this by dousing them with herbs and holy water. And it's like a beautiful choreographed dance. It's like you're saying, in the least, it doesn't require, it doesn't attract judgment. It's like you're going, I'm really struggling at the moment, and therefore I'm telling you about it in this particular way, which I know you will understand. And then the community come together and support the girls who are going through this, and then they have the ritualized treatment, which everyone knows will make them better, and it does make them better. If I see people with really similar seizures in this country, I saw videos of greasy sickness. I didn't see it in person, but it looked exactly like some of the seizures that I see. Well, what would happen to you in this country? Well, you go to a casualty department where probably you'd be not given particularly sympathetic treatment by a doctor who'd never seen it before. Then you'd be sent for a brain scan and a variety of other tests. And then, you know, you'd either be misdiagnosed with epilepsy, which happens quite a lot, or you could be sent to a psychologist where they begin probing into your family history. And then I guarantee you that that's a route that doesn't lead to recovery, because it sort of makes people feel stigmatized, and it elevates the anxiety levels. Whereas what happens in greasy sickness, when they recognize this, it's cured. The same seizures in the UK are only cured about 30% of the time. 70% of people continue having seizures. So, you know, I came away from this thinking, having to really question my own training as a medical doctor, which is, you know, if ritual works, how do I incorporate that so that it, you know, that I can make people better at that same rate? Don't ask me that question, because I still haven't established the answer to that.
It's because we're so used to kind of saying it's either it's a herbal remedy or it's biological medicine, and it's this kind of no interaction between the two. Most of us think one works and one doesn't.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that it's when you need to look at things in a much more holistic way to cure these kinds of people.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And also we kind of, we looked at, I'm not suggesting that, there's lots of ways in which alternative practices I don't like, mostly because people are making a lot of money out of vulnerable people. But, if one has to look and say, if there is some aspect of the ritual that makes people better, maybe that's worth thinking about. But I think probably more important than the sort of alternative therapy or the ritual is the belief system. People need to be treated with respect and believe they can get better. That's what made them better. It wasn't the specific herbs or anything like that. So again, we're back to expectations. How do you feel when you have this disorder? How do people treat you? And what are your expectations for recovery?
And the community element of it is so important. I did kind of want to ask that, many of us would agree that we're a lot less involved in community these days than maybe we once were. We certainly don't, organize around religion nearly as much as, our ancestors and our people in our family history did. Do you think that has had any effect on the way that mental illnesses are treated in this country?
Well, I think that not so much pure mental illnesses, but in terms of help seeking. So you get help from whoever is, you seek help from whoever is available to you. And the way you elicit help depends on who is available to you. So if you're in a community where you have, all the family live in the same house and that you can get support from within your family, that may be where you go. If you're a spiritual person, that may be where you go. But, for communities like our own, these sort of sources of support are dwindling, people don't turn to the church. People are much less likely to live in multi-generational houses and so forth. But a place that you can always go to for help, or one would hope you can always go to for help, is go to your doctor and explain something that's happening to you. So, I'm not suggesting this is done consciously, but at an unconscious level, physical symptoms are an effective way of eliciting help. And if the only help there is your doctor, then that may be the most effective way of expressing your suffering.
And the explanation that people give for their various suffering and the way that they cling to certain things and certain ideas of what may be causing it, I thought was really interesting in Colombia with the girls who were again having contagious seizures there, and how it came down to the HPV vaccination.
Yeah. And this was the most disturbing story for me. So there's a small town in Colombia called El Carmen, and since about, I've forgotten the exact date now, but since about 2014, schoolgirls have been developing contagious seizures in that town. Now, this is a tale as old as time, is seizures spreading through schools. It's really common. It's happened in this country. It happens in every country. It's not specific to a culture. And what usually happens is that maybe one young girl in an appropriate setting faints. And I say young girl, women are more inclined to faint for no reason other than they've got lower blood pressure. So maybe a young woman in an appropriate setting faints. And that sort of fear and anxiety that is provoked in other people can affect either blood pressure and cause them to faint, or can also just cause a kind of psychosomatic hysterical seizure passing through the class, just a wave of fear and anxiety created by one event. And usually when that happens, not that unusual, usually gone in a day. If it lasts 2 days, it would be unusual. That happened in a small town in Colombia a few years ago, but it didn't disappear. It began spreading from one class to another class, and then from school to school, until in this particular town, about 1,000 girls had been caught up in this contagion of seizures. Now, seizures is my specialist area of interest. So I went to Colombia to try and understand what was happening and why this was happening to them. I'd seen lots of videos of seizures. That's what I do for a large amount of my time, is look at videos of seizures. It was obvious these were hysterical. Again, I'm only using that word because I don't want to be sort of, I think a lot of wordplay is used to not be explicit about some of these disorders, to try and make them respectable through wordplay. I'd rather they were respectable because we believe they're real things and that these people need help, and not because I find a word that is sort of neutral enough. But about 1,000 girls have been caught up in these seizures in Colombia. And I was so disturbed when I went there, because essentially the girls have been told they've been poisoned by the HPV vaccine. So I met some young women who'd actually recovered. And when I said to them, well, you know, brilliant, you recovered, because as I've said, expectations matter. So I like to be positive when someone's doing well. And they said, well, yeah, I recovered, but the poison is still inside me. They absolutely believe, these young women, that they had been poisoned, and that therefore they could not recover. And they had fallen prey to activists coming from the United States, many of whom had Colombian backgrounds, but came to the village as soon as they heard about these seizures and began telling the local people that they had been poisoned by the HPV vaccine. And that created a lot of activism and a lot of marches to sort of, you know, stamp out this poison, stop poisoning our children. And unfortunately, once that sort of information took hold, and once, you know, I met young women who, you know, they told me that they were told that they'd probably get cancer before they ever started having the seizures, just based on these, based on the fact that they'd had HPV vaccine. And once that takes hold, you know, there you have, if you believe a poison is living inside you, then how are you ever going to recover? And actually the government there and the health system, I personally thought they did a great job. A lot of people in the town would say they didn't. They did a great job in the difficult situation they were in, and that everything they did, the people said they were lying. You've poisoned us. It's a cover up. You've poisoned us, because activists from outside the community were telling them that. And there were lots of, that's why it's really important to understand, I think, sometimes the history of these situations. There were lots of really important reasons why these people might be more trusting of outsiders than of insiders, because this is a war-torn area where they've had lots of corruption, lots of reasons not to believe insurance companies, you know, and then someone comes from America, you know, and to a place that very rarely had outside visitors. So they have every reason to believe they're more scientific and they know more than the local doctors. So the local doctors were just overruled, and that outbreak is still ongoing. It was really disturbing.
That mistrust in authority kind of plays up again in Kazakhstan massively when it comes to thinking that it's the government out to poison everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you know, sure, we have it everywhere, don't we? I mean, why did, you know, President Trump get elected? Why do we have Brexit? I mean, we're all plagued to various kind of campaigns. We're all subject to these campaigns and influenced by them. But in Kazakhstan, I went to Kazakhstan, and I have to say, I was really hoping when I went to Kazakhstan, I'd come back and say, you all must go on holidays there. Listen, I had the most amazing time, but wait a few years before you go on holidays there. They're not quite ready. But it was an amazing experience. This beautiful little town called, why am I calling it a beautiful little town? Because I felt it was beautiful, called Krasnogorsk. And in Krasnogorsk, I think it started in about 2012, about 133 people in a town of 300 fell into a mystery illness, a sleeping sickness again. So these people just fell asleep wherever they were and couldn't be woken up, had to go to hospital, stayed in hospital maybe a day or a week. It wasn't as bad as resignation syndrome. And then they eventually woke up. And again, these people, they've got a good health service there. They had dozens of scans, lumbar punctures, EEG tests, blood tests. They were tested for every poison known to mankind. They were flown to Russia, Moscow, so they could get more tests done. Everything came back as normal. And these people believed that they were being poisoned by the government because they believed that the government was trying to clear this town. It was a town that used to have thousands of people living there, and then there was only 300. And they thought they were being poisoned so that they had to leave the town. Now, I went to this poison town, one might say slightly foolhardy, but I did what doctors do, right? I went to this town and it's run down. You know, the buildings are crumbling. These people's lives are hard. It's minus 50 degrees in the winter. They used to be quite well off country, but, not country. This town used to be quite well off. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they had a big change in their circumstances. So they went from being well off to poor. So I did what doctors do. And I just thought, oh, well, do you know what? It just looks a bit miserable here. I think I'd fall asleep too in these circumstances. And also when they had the sleeping sickness, it it attracted loads of people to the town. So it brought reporters and it brought scientists. So it took a town that was dying and it brought it to life again. And I thought, well, that's as simple as the story is, that this is a depressing place to live, and these people are expressing their distress and asking for help this way. Then I went there, and I just, the story was so different than I was expecting, and it really taught me how nuance in people's stories is important. You don't, and doctors do this all the time. We say, oh, you're stressed or you're depressed, and people say back to us, I'm not stressed, actually, I'm not depressed, it's something else. And that's very much my experience in Kazakhstan. I thought they were stressed and depressed, but then I learned this amazing town. So in the 1970s, these people were shipped from Russia, or there's no water, they were bussed from Russia, from places like Siberia, completely, in Soviet era, they had no choice. They were put on a bus, they were mining families, and they were told, you're going to Krasnogorsk, which is a town in the middle of absolute nowhere in Kazakhstan. They didn't even know where they were going, and the bus stopped a few times on the way, and they thought every time they stopped in some depressing place, they just thought, oh God, please don't let this be it. And then finally, I'm sure many days later, they arrived in this beautiful town. This is in the 1970s. This was a purpose-built secret uranium mining town, built by Russia and built to be kept secret, so that all of these workers were to be contained in this town. And for that reason, this town had everything: brand new apartment blocks, a creche, a cinema, a fantastic hospital. So all the people who I met who were affected by the sleeping sickness kept telling me that the town was paradise. And I was looking at these pictures of this absolute dilapidated place and just thinking, these people are insane, It actually was paradise in the 1970s for them. And they had lives that no one in the Soviet Union had. And they had lives that no one else in Kazakhstan was having. Their shops had brilliant produce. Their roads were beautiful. Their houses were beautiful. Then the Soviet Union broke down in 91 and the uranium mine shut down. But that's not when they got sick. They actually didn't get sick until about 2012. And that was what I had to understand, is that, yes, they lost this beautiful town and they faced hardship, but you know what? They were hardy people. They come from Siberia and places like that. They knew what hardship was. So when the town shut down, they adjusted to it. The thing that broke them in the end, the thing that caused the sleeping sickness, is that, these people were getting older, and, it became apparent to them as they lost more and more amenities in this town that they were going to have to leave. And I feel that it was really like sort of trying to leave a marriage or leaving a relationship where that you loved someone once, but how it's hard to say, well, now I'm going to end it completely. And that was sort of how they were with this town. They knew that they had to leave, but this had been the place they raised their families. They had deep emotional connection to it. And the sleeping sickness came along as a sort of solution to them, not because they were suffering through hardship, but because it was a kind of a love story. They knew they had to leave. The sleeping sickness kind of gave them permission to leave. And when they left and they were rehoused in another place, they all just completely recovered.
Well, we're going to end it there, not end it there, but we're going to take a little break there so you can grab some more drinks, which I believe are complimentary at the back, although I'm not sure if we have a waitress to help out with that, and also an absolute, and then we'll come back in about 10-15 minutes or so. So thank you so much so far, Dr. O'Sullivan. Okay, everyone, so we're going to get started again. If everyone's got, I do hope there's no one in the loop, but we'll just start slowly and then hopefully there won't be too many issues. So we left off talking about Kazakhstan and the fascinating situation there and how they recovered once, you know, they've been relocated to their new areas. And I kind of wanted to change tack and talk a little bit about Cuba, which has a really interesting story when it comes to psychosomatic illnesses.
So, I mean, I think that there's this real sort of thing that people say when you start talking about psychosomatic illnesses, and that's sort of, well, you know, my wife, my brother couldn't have it because they're not that sort of person, you know, or what is that sort of person? We all have these physiological changes going on in our body and we can all misinterpret them. So there is no particular sort of person. And that is nicely exemplified really by something that is still actually happening. It started in the American Embassy in Cuba in December 2016. It's now spreading around the world to other embassies. So in December 2016 in Cuba, you've got to remember that the American Embassy in Cuba had been closed for a very long time. And it opened up there was a lot of fear and anxiety around the reopening, and there was a lot of concern about sort of the malign actions of Russian and Cuban spies, etc. So it was a slightly tense time when the embassy opened. Then in December 2016, someone who worked in the American embassy in Cuba, I think they woke in the middle of the night and they heard a strange sound. And along with hearing that strange sound, they started getting odd symptoms. So buzzing in their ears, headache, dizziness, unsteadiness, those sort of symptoms. Now, it's hard to know because exactly how this evolved and then spread quickly to other people, but it probably began with the first person who, having good reason, this person was well versed in kind of intelligence kind of information and had reason to believe that the embassy staff could be under attack or had reason to feel that they should be a little bit worried about people spying on them, for example. So this person interpreted, either they or someone they told their story to, interpreted the hearing of this sound as an attack. And therefore the sound became sort of, they had been attacked by something like a sonic weapon, and that had caused their symptoms. And that started the rumor in the American embassy in Cuba that the embassy staff were being attacked by a sonic weapon. And that then slowly spread through embassy staff. So other people began hearing sounds and getting a similar but not identical constellation of symptoms to the first person, mostly sort of headache, dizziness, unsteadiness, tiredness, things like that. All of this was kept really, really hush-hush for about between December 16 and August 17. During this time, there was a lot of concern in the embassy, and you had a lot of people at really the highest level talking to the embassy staff and saying, if you hear a sound, you should hide behind a wall or you should move to evade the sound. And they were, first of all, been asked to come forward if they had any medical problems. And then as the kind of anxiety built, they were actually being told to go to doctors even if they didn't have any medical problems, just in case they'd been attacked by a sonic weapon. This caught the attention of the of mainstream news in August 2017, and since then it's just continued to build. This idea that embassy staff are being attacked by a sound weapon. There were lots of medical doctors, mostly based in the US, involved in this case, and they all wrote papers that were titled, I'm not going to give the exact titles because I can't remember them exactly, but entitled things like, you know, a study of people who have been attacked by a sonic weapon. That's not how they were entitled, but that was the summation of what these people were saying they were studying. So they were assuming these people had been studied by a sonic weapon and then describing the outcome of what had happened. There's a big problem with all of this. There's no such thing as a sonic weapon, but let's imagine that we don't all know everything there is to know about intelligence agencies. So we don't know that. How do I know what the intelligence agencies have? What I do know as a neurologist is that sound doesn't damage the brain. And that's incontrovertible. So even if somebody in Cuba or Russia has developed a sonic weapon, it would not damage the brain. Sound damages the ear. So that has to be an exceptionally loud sound, can damage the ear, but an exceptionally loud sound does not do anything to the brain. And yet, this idea grew amongst doctors and politicians, highly educated and intelligent people, that these people were being attacked by a sonic weapon, and no amount of explaining that sound doesn't damage the brain was sufficient to convince people. And it was really interesting because it was a great demonstration of a thing called cognitive dissonance. So our brains like to we like things to kind of make sense, and we struggle when we have information that doesn't fit with what we believe. So I believe I've been attacked by a sound weapon, but sound doesn't damage the brain. So you have to make lots of leaps of logic in order to make those two things make sense. And lots of leaps took place. So for example, one of the scientists or doctors looking after the patients who had been in the news all the time saying, you know, sound weapon, sound weapon, sound weapon, eventually had to kind of say, well, okay, sound doesn't damage the brain, so how can I make sense of this? So they said, well, maybe it's a different kind of energy weapon, like a ultrasonic weapon or a microwave energy. Now we've got a problem, because the whole reason we think there's a energy weapon is because they heard a sound. But now they're talking about weapons that don't even make a sound. So it doesn't make sense, but they then had to make sense of that. So then they said, well, maybe the microwave weapon causes heating up of blood in the blood vessels in the ear, and that causes a popping sound. So the person's hearing a sound. Well, you know, that's all very fanciful, but why would a microwave weapon only attack the brain? So if you've got an energy weapon directed at you, it's really sort of like, it's a folk story to say that a sound weapon damages the ear. And this is very much relevant to how psychosomatic disorders are diagnosed. It has to make biological sense. So someone somewhere thought sound goes through the ear, it must have direct access to the brain. But actually sound just is like any sensation. It's like it travels along nerves. Sounds travel along nerves to the brain. It doesn't just go into the brain, you know, so it's the same as touch or anything else. So it's a kind of a folk story to think that sound can get through your ear into your brain. If a blast was big enough to damage your brain, it would damage your other organs as well. And they're actually a lot less protected than your brain. So a sort of an energy weapon would not have a special preference for your brain. So the whole thing just made zero sense. And yet it persists to this day. So much so that I still see the reports regularly. Apparently there was an attack in a hotel in London recently. I should say that no one's ever recorded a sound. At one point, somebody thought they'd recorded a sound, and it was on all the news web sites in the US. As I always say, slightly sort of cruelly, it seemed to have lost its potency when it was played over the airwaves to millions of people in the US. But then someone analyzed it, and it was the sound of a cricket. So it's a ludicrous story, but the number of highly intelligent people who believe it. And now you can read in the New York Times things like, I read an account recently where a man who worked for an embassy somewhere in the US was driving his car, and he had his baby in the back, and he got to a crossroads, and he suddenly felt very sick, and he had a headache, and he didn't feel well. And then his baby started to cry, and then he drove away from the crossroads, and his baby stopped crying, and he felt better, and he thinks he was attacked by a sonic weapon. And that was in the New York Times. So it's mainstream news are perpetuating these stories. And they don't seem to care a great deal about the biology. But the point is to, you know, if you're working in an embassy and people start telling you to be scared and telling you to hide behind walls and telling you something terrible is going to happen to you, that's a classic circumstance for examining your body and noticing things. And do you know what? I'm sure if we all thought terribly hard about it, we've all felt dizzy at some point this year. But if we think that there is a possibility of a sonic weapon aimed at us, instead of dismissing that dizziness, you know, we might become its next victim. So watch out. I'm waiting to see if I'll be attacked by a sonic weapon. I feel like I'm really tempting it. We'll see what happens. I'll tell you if it happens.
Obviously, you talked before about how, doctors really do have to look at the social situation that's surrounding these people. It must become quite difficult when a doctor actually has to look at legitimate geopolitics in order to try and diagnose someone. This will stop maybe when tensions between Cuba and the United States are better.
Well, I mean, a lot of people had a lot to gain from this story because a lot of people did not want the American embassy to open in Cuba. So, it played perfectly into the hands of some American politicians who had never wanted that embassy to open and who therefore sort of had a great I told you so moment when people started getting sick in the embassy. And there was a lot of people then, I think, who wedded themselves to the sonic weapon theory who would now have a great difficulty extricating themselves. So a lot of doctors wrote papers about this sonic weapon. And, they went on news shows where they said things like, the phone rang, I picked it up and it said, Dr. O'Sullivan, we need you. It's the sort of FBI, we need you or whatever. And, they're really caught up in the excitement of this and then really nailing the colors to the mast about what the cause was. Now, a lot of people are going to have to stand back, as I will if I'm attacked by a sonic weapon, I should say. But a lot of people potentially to undo this will have to stand back and say, do you know what, I think I was wrong. And you know what, that's not that easy to do if you've been all over the press asserting a particular opinion. So I think, first of all, these people have been caught in a sort of web of other people's pride, where so many people have told them that the sonic weapon is real. And let's face it, most of the people who told them it wasn't real weren't their own doctors. Their own doctors said they had been attacked by a sonic weapon. Their own doctors wrote multiple papers and went on the news saying they'd been attacked by the sonic weapon. It's only external scientists who are saying such a thing is impossible. So the people are trapped in this sort of situation where you've got senators, President Trump, when he was president, made comments about it. And, they've got the most senior people that they know telling them they've been attacked. And what are they expected to do in that situation? They're in a very difficult situation and there's a lot of pride involved.
What is really interesting is when you compare this particular incident to, say, the greasy sickness or the girls in Colombia, because of course, this is not just women, this is happening too.
Yeah. I mean, that's such an important point. I mean, basically, I said that there's no anyone can get this, but the truth of the matter is that some people are more vulnerable, and it is true to say that women are more vulnerable. Now, these sort of disorders affect women, as often seen as, it's often presented as it being that women are labeled this way because doctors are dismissing them. I do think it is a feminist issue, but not in that way. I think the problem is that women are more vulnerable to psychosomatic disorders, and that's why these conditions are so disrespected and presented to people in the way that they are. I think, if this was a disorder of middle-aged male bankers, it might not be considered to be a condition that you laugh at and dismiss and don't take seriously. I think it's because it very often is young women who are the ones with the sort of least sort of power who are affected by these conditions. And that's where the kind of sexism here lies. And I noticed as I was visiting different communities and following these different outbreaks, it was absolutely unbelievable the different ways that people were talked about, depending on whether they were young women or whether they were men or older women. So if you're a young woman in Colombia, or there was also an outbreak of ticks in upstate New York, so it's not just poor communities like that in Colombia, it could be anywhere, then what will happen is that in upstate New York, there was all these girls got these kind of tick-like movements that evolved into seizures. And newspaper headlines said things like the witches of Leroy, and newspapers speculated over it. So they actually call them witches. I know we all know what they were referring to them to, but what are these girls supposed to do when they're referred to in that way, except rail against the diagnosis? Their lives were poured over, and things were said about them like, that people wrote a fictional book about the outbreak and said they were all fighting about a boy. It's just desperately insulting. And they picked over their lives and said, well, she comes from a broken family. Her father doesn't have a job. She once had a public argument with her father. you know, so it all became about sort of how fragile these girls were, how miserable their lives were, and all of the worst possible old-fashioned connotations of hysteria were leveled at these girls. In Colombia, the young women, they said things about them like, she needs a husband, you know, she needs to have sex, you know, those were the dismissals. That's how young women are treated when they have these disorders. Now in the embassy, it was a mixture of men and women, but there was many men involved in that outbreak. And essentially what happened there is that everyone couldn't even countenance the psychosomatic diagnosis because they were men. And no one made any comment about what their lives were like. No one even, there was no mention ever, or did they come from broken families? I mean, these were diplomats. They probably had worked in difficult war-torn places. I'm sure as many of them had broken families as in any other place. Their personal lives were not even mentioned. When women are involved in these kind of outbreaks, especially young women, they're talked about in a terribly derogatory way. And I think it was really striking. So I think what's happening is that, you know, the diagnosis is being rejected for men because they're not women. And that when the diagnosis is given to young women, it's given to them in such a pejorative way that makes it very difficult for them to accept. And therefore, they do the completely logical thing, which is they seek out other causes.
We're coming quite close to time, so we'll be doing questions in a minute. So if you have any, do start thinking of those. And for those online as well, you can absolutely ask questions. Just pop them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure that they're asked as well. But I kind of wanted to finish by talking about something that continually comes up in the book, and is something that is a massive myth that you do an amazing job of dispelling, which is that psychosomatic disorders are fake and less real than real disorders or real conditions.
I mean, people betray themselves in the language all the time when it comes to these disorders. I hear it all the time, you know, that someone's in a wheelchair and you think they have multiple sclerosis, and then you learn their scans were normal, it's psychosomatic, and people will say to me, there was nothing wrong with her after all. Well, you know, that's kind of language. We kind of think if someone's in a wheelchair, that if they have multiple sclerosis, that's a real thing, and therefore they are really paralyzed. But if it's psychosomatic, they're not really paralyzed. If you're in a wheelchair and you can't move your legs, there's something wrong with you one way or the other. And we should be judging people by the degree of disability that they have, not by the sort of underlying pathology. But it's also really important for me with my patients to explain to them, because I think there's always that sort of misunderstanding that, you know, this is sort of, I'm going mad, I'm doing it on purpose, I could stop it if I wanted to. I always sort of give examples to my patients, like, you know, if I'm, you know, I'm not as nervous tonight as I can be, but sometimes I'm so nervous I shake like a leaf, you know, and you wouldn't say, or, you know, your heart starts going very quickly when you're scared. You wouldn't say to a person to whom that is happening, oh, you're imagining it, your heart's not going very quickly. It is going quickly. It's just not a disease. And you wouldn't say to that person, stop it, because you would realize that what is happening to them is a physiological thing they can't control. However, you would appreciate that with certain techniques, they could learn to control it over time. And that's what these sort of other psychosomatic symptoms are like. They're uncontrollable physiological things that are every bit as real as my heart going very quickly if I'm nervous, and every bit as uncontrollable as that. And I think if people understand that, then they don't have to worry about this constant judgment of you're doing it on purpose, which is something that people really worry about when they get a diagnosis like this.
Well, we're going to open the floor to any questions. So if you do have, yes, we're going to go straight away to the front. We do have a roving mic.
Okay.
Hi. I actually put it, I didn't want to forget it, but because I thought of it at the beginning and I didn't, so I've written it down.
Well done, very organized.
So when I was at school, anorexia was contagious. And during lockdown, I read that Tourette's had become the new contagion. I'm not going to recall it correctly, but I think it was like an increase of 400% in women well, I say women, very young girls were being diagnosed with Tourette's. So I was wondering, you know, the Salem witch trials or Beatles mania, why? Well, you've said that girls are more susceptible because they're often more vulnerable, but what can we do, I guess, to prevent this? Because I know that I wasn't particularly susceptible to any of these contagious things, and I don't know what it was about me, but why and what can we do?
I don't think yes, you're right. I think these are related phenomena, and I also read about Tourette's and I think that women are slightly more vulnerable for two reasons. I don't know. I mean, no one absolutely knows the answer why women are more vulnerable, but I would imagine there's two important things. First of all, our physiology, especially as a young woman, your body is changing, and it's not just changing once, it's changing all the time in a cyclical way. And that creates a lot more of this, what we call white noise, to be misunderstood. So if your body is constantly changing and you don't know, well, what's that? Is that normal? So I think we also have things like lower blood pressure, etc., which makes us more prone to things like fainting, for example. So I think we have a certain physiological vulnerability, but also probably a psychological vulnerability to the way that we socialize and worry and about what other people think and stuff like that. An odd thing happened when I was writing this book, because I started out with this sort of idea that if I could just explain this to everyone in the world, that basically then we'd stop this. And then I realized, how actually this is part of human nature. It's not necessarily right. The thing to do is not necessarily to stop it. The thing to do is to understand when it's happening so that it doesn't evolve into disability. So we all get these kind of physical changes, or to a different degree. I get loads of different dizzinesses and things. It doesn't evolve into disability because I recognize the things that happen to me. And if I feel a bit dizzy, or I feel like, anxious in some physical way, I kind of think, okay, what's causing that anxiety? And then I sort of feel better as a result of thinking about it that way. So I no longer think it's a matter of eradicating things. It's a matter of helping people to understand the body does respond in this way, and it's not always related to a disease. Because the thing that ruins people, it's okay if you're caught in a pandemic to have some tick-like movements and to express your distress physically. What's not okay is that you then end up going to a doctor who does lots of tests and scans, and then you become more anxious, and then you start noticing new symptoms. So it's not the initial symptoms I think we need to deal with. I think it's the way we respond to the symptoms that leads people down the road, like the embassy staff. Somebody felt dizzy one day, the next thing you know, you've got people chronically disabled with brain injury. So you can't change how you respond. You can't change these physiological things. You just learn to read them.
Anyone? Oh, yes.
Do you think the original fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty has the same origin?
I would not hope to be able to answer that question at all. I wouldn't even attempt. What the problem in medicine with these sort of the problem in medicine, say, if we have things like the Salem witch trial, etc., that are often related to these kind of conditions, is that so many of the stories that are related to these conditions, there's loads of weird things that have happened around the world throughout history, and we wonder, oh, is this related, is that related? But before we had sort of the level of medicine that we had now, we can never answer that question. It is speculation, but it also is, it's problematic for these people, because it's a bit like not so much the Sleeping Beauty, because that's a fictional story, but say that Salem, the minute you start telling diplomats in Cuba or fainting schoolgirls in New York that they have something to do with Salem witch trials, you have lost them as patients. You have alienated them. You have essentially insulted them. So I think what we need to do is I would like people to put aside all of the historical associations, because there's nothing really more insulting if you're going through a health crisis than to be compared to the witches of Salem, for example. So, and that happens. And therefore, I think we're best to try and understand the physiology of these things with modern medicine and leave the historical associations behind, even though they may often be, apt.
I've got some audio will come to you in just a second. We'll do some, actually, Audrey will go for you, since you're there.
So there are people who believe that the built environment is affecting their health. I'm thinking about electromagnetism. There are people who will absolutely swear that 5G masts or pylons near their houses are making them sick, feeling ill, headache. So do you think that's a psychosomatic thing?
I think that there's no evidence at all that 5G masks make anyone ill. But I think much like the sonic weapon story, if a story is salient within your environment, if it's makes sense within the world in which you're living now, and you have reason to believe that the threat could be real, even if it's been proven not to be, then that can make you sick. And I certainly don't think 5G masks make anybody sick. And I do believe that people who suffer through them probably do have a psychosomatic disorder.
Oh, we'll come to you in just a second. We've got some online questions from people at home. We'll go for the first one, first of all.
So this is from Marie. She says, thank you for mentioning GPs and holistic care at the start. We see patients every day who urgently need their social determinants of health addressed. Can you recommend, beyond your books, any resources or further training for GPs managing psychosomatic and functional illnesses and their underlying social and psychological factors?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I would want to emphasize that point. I mean, the biggest problem is in hospitals, because what happens in hospitals now is that people are so specialized that they not, you can literally look after like one big toe, and, I only do the left big toe and you do the right big toe. And then what happens is, like, if somebody comes in with a more complex problem, no one gets to the bottom of it, because I can get off the hook very easily as a doctor. If you don't have the disease that my clinic, the epilepsy clinic, if you don't have epilepsy, it doesn't matter how much you're suffering, I'm quite within my rights actually to discharge you. Am I morally right, or am I medically right to discharge you? No. But the system of medicine is such that we're so specialized in hospitals that we're actually terrible at holistic medicine now. GPs, I think, are fantastic, and they're the people who do this best, but they need to be supported by others. I'm afraid there isn't any great resource for helping people, and I think that's where we need to start paying more attention, because I'm still at the point now where I can tell someone that they have one of these disorders, and I can't find anyone who can treat them, or I can refer them to a treatment service, and it takes a year for them to be seen, which we'd be horrified if someone had diabetes or some other disease and it took a year. So I'm terribly sorry, I can't recommend any resources. And I think that's where our attention as doctors should be now, is in developing services and strategies for managing these. When I qualified as a medical student, I don't know the age of the person who asked the question, but when I qualified as a medical student, you never ever discussed these sort of disorders. You just didn't. And now, many years later, they are beginning to be discussed at conferences and written about in journals. It's beginning to be given legitimacy as a medical condition. But we're not at the point where we have good treatment strategies yet.
I will go for the lady in the lovely dress, and then we'll go for one more online, and I think we'll have to cut it there for this evening. We do have a microphone if you want to ask the question.
I just wondered what, with the resignation syndrome, what the percentage boy-girl was.
Yes, it is a higher percentage of girls. So like most of these conditions, it's about 2/3 girls and about 1/3 boy. Most psychosomatic conditions will be similar, apart from a couple and the sonic weapon story. So it is even that is female predominant.
I've got an online question. Yes.
Is long COVID potentially a result of expectation of illness?
I think that there's absolutely no doubt that there must be people who are suffering during a pandemic without contracting the virus, for all the reasons that I've already explained. I think you can, now read in the media that, there's a large number of people who tested negative for the virus, and many of whom have very atypical symptoms. So if you now look at the websites for long COVID, it could have up to 200 symptoms. This is how psychosomatic disorders develop. You get caught in a pandemic and you're told that the main symptoms are cough, shortness of breath. I should remember them all, shouldn't I? I seem to be forgetting them. And then basically yeah, exactly. And then what happens is that, you're in the pandemic and you feel sick, but not with those exact symptoms, with some slightly different symptoms. And you think, well, I can't think of any other cause. Everything during a pandemic becomes blamed on a pandemic, and every new person brings their symptoms. This is called the classification effect. if you have a salient illness within your community, then people who aren't feeling well will use that illness, not consciously, unconsciously, to explain why they're not feeling well. And that will gradually mean that there will be people who have the illness, and then there are people who will be feeling unwell in other ways and will attribute it to the illness. And I think when you've accrued, 200 different symptoms for a disorder, then that is strong evidence for the very strong likelihood that a reasonable percentage of people with long COVID have a psychosomatic disorder. I think that long COVID is a useless term, quite frankly, at the moment, because it's just been applied to anyone who feels sick during a pandemic. Illnesses are supposed to have diagnostic criteria. It has no diagnostic criteria. It's a label one gives oneself if one is suffering at this particular point in time. Absolutely, if people have been in hospital and sick with COVID, I've worked in ITU during the pandemic, and people who survive that will undoubtedly have long-term symptoms. There's no doubt in my mind that people who were not hospitalized, who had a severe COVID illness, will suffer a post-viral syndrome for an amount of time, because it takes a while for your body to bounce back from that. But there will also be a significant number of people who are suffering in other ways purely because we're in a pandemic. And like, people in an embassy we were told to hide in our homes, and we were told to examine our bodies for symptoms, and we were told to be very frightened that something terrible was going to happen to us. And there will be a percentage of people who that is affected physically, who are not yet really been allowed to have a psychosomatic diagnosis. And when I say they're not being allowed, it's because if you listen to the news, people ring up, Woman's Hour and say, and by the way, I'm a fan of Woman's Hour, just in case it sounds like I'm not. They ring up Woman's Hour and they say, I went to my GP and I was dismissed as anxious. I was dismissed as psychosomatic. I was dismissed as depressed. But perhaps actually the GP was trying to give that person an honest account of what they thought was happening to them. But as long as we perceive depression, anxiety, and psychosomatic disorders as a dismissal, then people are forced to root around for more respectable explanations.
I think do we have maybe one more online question we can go to that we can get a relatively quick answer to? I don't know, to put you on the spot. Sorry. We don't want to keep you too long, everyone. But
so this is from John. He says, thanks for the fascinating talk. I work next door to you at Gosh, Gosh.
Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Yeah. Thanks. And see a lot of young patients with pervasive arousal withdrawal syndrome, which has a lot of overlap with the presentations you've been describing. Have you come across young people with this diagnosis? There's a little bit more. For me, the key aspects of their treatment are patients understanding support, addressing precipitating and perpetuating factors, and finding a way out for them with dignity. And psychoeducation are the close links between the mind and the body.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
in 10 seconds.
I personally don't treat that condition, but he is correct. I mean, this is there are definite overlaps. They're a little bit different because kind of the sort of resignation syndrome has a slightly more passive element than the condition he's describing, which is more, or rather, I don't personally care for these patients, but more about refusal than just withdrawing apathetically. But I think there's certainly a great degree of overlap in these conditions. And I agree that the treatment really is support and allowing a person believe they can recover.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. O'Sullivan, for joining us this evening. If we could give our speaker a round of applause, that would be fun.
Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
If it's okay, we'd love you to, if anyone's interested in purchasing a book, we do have books at the back, and it would be amazing if you could sign a few. That would be fantastic. Our next travel event, I believe, it will be at the Albright, or our next one for general consumption as opposed to just for members, and that will be on the 18th of August, I do believe, and that's all about thinking big about your future and making plans to achieve everything that you could possibly dream of. So do sign up for that one, and thank you all so much for coming this evening, and I hope you all have a lovely evening. Oh, so